Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. A Song for Anne. The clatter of carriage wheels on the cobblestones of Hampton Court was a frantic, irregular heartbeat counting down the final seconds of Anne's freedom. Through the thick, leaded glass, the palace rose from the autumn mist not as a home, but as a fortress of gilded stone and suffocating grandeur. Each turret and battlement seemed to whisper the same cold truth. Her life was no longer her own. In Brittany she was the Duchess Anne, a ruler in her own right. Her will the law of the land. Here she was a political necessity, a name on a treaty, a womb intended to secure an alliance. The autumn wind, sharp and tasting of wood smoke and damp earth, whipped at the cloaks of the receiving party as she descended. At its head stood a boy who was not yet a man, Prince Arthur. He was handsome in a severe English way, his features fine-boned and his expression as placid as a frozen lake. He bowed, his movements precise and tutored. "Your Grace," he said, his voice clear but devoid of warmth. "Welcome to England. I trust your journey was not unduly arduous. The recent rains have made the roads to Dover quite treacherous, which has, in turn, delayed the Florentine wool shipments." Anne, accustomed to the passionate greetings of her own people, could only offer a small, tight smile. He spoke of trade, not of her comfort, of commerce, not of the country she had left behind forever. He saw the treaty, not the woman. She was led through echoing corridors, her silk gown rustling, like dry leaves skittering across a grave. Tapestries depicting epic battles and stoic saints absorbed the sound of her footsteps, their woven figures seeming to watch her with pitiless eyes. Everything was meant to impress, to intimidate, to remind her of the power she was being married into, and the powerlessness of her own position within it. Her private chambers were opulent, a cage spun from gold thread and carved oak. A fire roared in the hearth, but its heat could not reach the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Her ladies-in-waiting fussed around her, chattering in French about the richness of the fabrics and the quality of the silver ewers, but their words were a meaningless buzz, like flies against a window pane. Later that evening, at the welcome feast, Anne sat beside Prince Arthur, a silent effigy in crimson and gold. The great hall was a cacophony of clattering plates, booming laughter, and the drone of courtiers vying for favour. Across the sea of faces she felt 1,000 eyes on her, measuring her, judging her. They assessed her breeding, her posture, the slope of her neck, calculating her worth in future heirs. She took a sip of wine, the spiced liquid, a bitter balm on her tongue, and then she heard it. It wasn't the boisterous fanfare of the royal musicians, but something else entirely. A single instrument, a lute, played from a shadowed alcove near the great fireplace. The melody was not English, nor was it entirely Breton, but a sad, searching tune that seemed to understand the very shape of the ache in her chest. It was a melody of longing, of exile. Her eyes scanned the shadows, seeking the source. She saw him then. He was not dressed in the flamboyant livery of the court musicians, but in simple dark wool. His head was bent over his instrument, his dark hair falling across his brow. His fingers moved over the strings with a lover's intimacy, coaxing from the wood and gut a sound so pure and sorrowful it silenced the chaos in her mind. He was an island of quiet intensity in an ocean of noise. He looked up just for a moment, his gaze sweeping the hall, and for a fraction of a second his eyes, dark and deep, seemed to meet hers. There was no recognition, only a shared momentary stillness. Then a courtier laughed too loudly. The spell was broken, and he retreated back into his music, into the shadows. That night, alone in the vast cold bed, Anne listened to the autumn wind howling through the narrow windows of her chamber. It sounded like a lament. The flickering candlelight cast dancing giants on the walls, spectres of her new life. She thought of the cold prince, the prying eyes, the crushing weight of her jewelled gown, and she thought of the man with the lute, whose music had spoken a language she understood better than any words uttered that day. She pulled the heavy furs closer, a single tear tracing a cold path down her temple and into her hair. In Brittany I was a duchess, she thought, the words a silent, bitter refrain. Here I am merely a treaty signed in flesh. The song from the shadows was the only thing that felt real, a fragile thread of connection in a world of gilded isolation. It was a song for the lonely, and tonight she was its most devoted listener. The weeks that followed bled into one another, a dreary procession of grey skies and greyer duties. Late winter held the palace in its icy grip, and Anne's world shrank to the prescribed paths between her chambers, the dining hall, and the royal chapel. It was in the chapel, seeking a moment's respite from the ceaseless political manoeuvring of the court, that she found him again. He was alone, seated on a simple wooden bench, his lute resting across his knees. The cavernous space was empty save for the two of them, the air still and cold. He wasn't playing the sorrowful ballads of the great hall, but a light, intricate piece that danced in the solemn air, each note a spark of defiance against the gloom. The music stopped her breath. She stood in the doorway, hidden by the shadows of the arch, unwilling to break the spell. When the last note faded, its echo hanging in the air like a ghost, he sighed, a sound of deep personal satisfaction. It was then that he saw her. He startled, rising quickly to his feet and offering a clumsy bow. "Forgive me, my lady," he said, his voice a low tenor, richer than she'd expected. "I did not mean to disturb your prayers." He assumed, from her simple dress and uncovered hair, that she was one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. "You did not disturb me," Anne replied, her voice softer than she intended. She stepped into the weak light filtering through the stained glass. "Your music was beautiful." A faint, surprised smile touched his lips. "You are kind to say so. It is a simple piece, my own." The honesty of the encounter, free from the suffocating protocol that defined her every other interaction, was intoxicating. "I am Anne," she said, deliberately omitting her title. "Thomas," he replied, with a slight nod. "Just Thomas." Their first conversation was a hesitant dance. He spoke of the court with a wry, weary honesty, calling it a gilded cage where the birds sing for their supper. She found herself laughing, a real, unburdened sound that felt foreign in her own throat. She spoke of the music of her homeland, of lively Breton folk songs that smelled of the sea and open fields. This became their secret. They began to meet in the quiet corners of the palace, the disused music chamber with its dusty harpsichords, or the formal gardens where the first crocuses were beginning to push through the frozen earth. He taught her a sad, lovely English ballad about a knight and his lost love. In return, she hummed a Breton melody, a lullaby her mother used to sing. "Music needs no translation," Thomas said one afternoon, his fingers guiding hers on the neck of the lute. His touch was light, professional, yet it sent a tremor through her. The warmth of his shared breath in the cold room was more real than any jewel she'd been given. It speaks heart to heart. Their fragile harmony was shattered the day he discovered who she truly was. He had been waiting for her in the garden when he saw her walking with Prince Arthur, her ermine-trimmed cloak marking her as royalty beyond any doubt. The blood drained from his face. Later, when he saw her alone, the easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a chasm of rank and duty. "Your Grace," he murmured, his bow now as deep and formal as any other courtier's. "Thomas, please," she begged, the words catching in her throat. "I am a court musician," he said, his voice tight with a bitterness she hadn't heard before. "You are the future Queen of England. There is no pleas between us." The invisible walls of her station had risen around her once more, higher and more impenetrable than ever. He was right. Their connection was an impossible fantasy, a hidden harmony that could never be played for the world to hear. The engagement ceremony was set for the first day of May. As the date approached, the palace buzzed with preparations. The ringing of the chapel bells, meant to be a joyous proclamation, sounded to Anne like funeral tolls. They were not celebrating a union of love, but hammering the final nails into the coffin of her old life, of the woman she might have been. The woman who could laugh with a musician in a winter garden. The woman who was, for a few stolen moments, just Anne. The threat of discovery and the finality of her impending marriage did not sever the thread between Anne and Thomas. Instead, it pulled it taut, transforming their tentative connection into something sharp, bright, and dangerous. Their secret meetings became more infrequent, but infinitely more precious, charged with the energy of all they could not say in the open. One moonless night, Thomas led her not to the gardens or the music room, but up a winding stone staircase to a small, forgotten tower room where he kept his instruments. It was his sanctuary, a space that was wholly his. A single candle burned, its flame dancing in the draught, casting their shadows long and intertwined against the cold stone walls. "I cannot give you jewels or titles, your grace," he said softly, his back to her as he picked up his lute. "I have only this." He played for her then, a private concert in the heart of the sleeping palace. It was not a performance, it was a confession. Each note was a declaration, each chord a question. The music built from a tender, wistful melody into a passionate crescendo that spoke of desperate love and impossible longing. It was the sound of his heart laid bare. When the music finally faded, silence rushed in to fill the void, thick and heavy with unspoken words. Anne found she was crying, silent tears she hadn't realised were falling. "What will become of me, Thomas?" she whispered into the darkness. "When I am his wife, when I am queen, will I remember my own song?" He set the lute aside and turned to her. In the flickering candlelight she could see the anguish in his eyes, a mirror of her own. "I will remember it for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers brushed a tear from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark in the kindling of their repressed feelings. He took a step closer, and the space between them seemed to hum with a palpable energy. "Anne," he breathed, using her name like a prayer. And that was all it took. She moved into his arms as if she belonged there, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. He lowered his head, and their first kiss was not gentle or hesitant, but a collision of desperation and need. It was the taste of rain on dry earth, of solace after a long battle. As if on cue, a low rumble of distant thunder echoed from beyond the tower walls, a soundtrack to the storm breaking inside them. In the aftermath, wrapped in the safety of the small room, they shared their truths. He told her his own secret. He was the son of a minor noble, a lord who had backed the wrong side in the recent wars and lost everything, his title, his lands, his honour. Thomas was a musician not by choice but by necessity, a gentleman living in the shadow of his family's disgrace. The shame he carried, his belief that he was unworthy, suddenly made his quiet pride and bitter observations of the court make sense. His vulnerability unlocked her own. Inspired by his courage, by the raw, honest music of his heart, Anne felt a stirring of her own forgotten artistry. In the stolen hours of the following week, she began to compose again, scratching out melodies on scraps of parchment. The notes flowed from her like a confection, a secret diary written in a language only he could truly understand, but their stolen world was too fragile to last. A lady in waiting, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, began to notice Anne's absences. Her questions became more pointed, her gaze more suspicious. One evening, as Anne slipped away to meet Thomas, the woman's eyes followed her down the corridor, a glint of jealous calculation in their depths. The heartbeat of their love was now matched by the rhythm of approaching danger, and they both knew that the beautiful, dangerous crescendo they had built could not be sustained. It had to break. The final weeks before the wedding descended like a shroud. The palace became a hive of frantic activity, the sound of seamstresses in Anne's chambers like the frantic fluttering of 1,000 sparrows trapped in a cage. They swarmed around her, pinning silks and velvets, their needles flashing like tiny silver daggers. She stood for hours, a living doll being dressed for sacrifice, the weight of the brocade and pearls a physical manifestation of her inescapable duty. One afternoon, a page brought Thomas a sealed letter bearing a French crest. A patron in Paris, a duke who had heard of his talent, was offering him a position at his court, a prestigious appointment, a chance for a new life, and most importantly, a clean escape before scandal could erupt and ruin them both. The letter was a lifeline, but it felt like a noose. To accept it meant leaving Anne to her fate. The breaking point came not with a clash of swords, but with a quiet, overheard conversation. Passing the king's private study, Anne paused as she heard her name. The door was slightly ajar, and the voices of King Henry and Prince Arthur drifted out, cold and pragmatic. "She has strong hips and a healthy constitution," the king said, his voice laced with the dry calculation of a horse breeder. "God willing, she will be quick with a son. An heir is paramount. The alliance with Brittany depends on it." "She is quiet," Arthur noted, his tone indifferent. "She will not cause trouble. A broodmare." The word screamed in her mind, a brand of hot iron on her soul. Her value, her entire existence was reduced to her ability to produce an heir. She was not a partner, not a person, but a vessel. The last of her romantic illusions about finding some small measure of respect in this marriage dissolved, leaving a bitter, cold emptiness. That night, she met Thomas in the gardens, the wind howling around them like a keening grief. The air was electric with their shared misery. "I received an offer," he told her, his face a mask of turmoil. "From France. We could go, Anne. Together. We could disappear. I would work, I would play in taverns. It wouldn't matter, as long as we were free." He gripped her arms, his eyes wild with a desperate hope. "Come with me." It was the ultimate temptation, a life of love, music, and freedom. But she saw the future with a terrible clarity. "If I run, the treaty is broken," she said, her voice hollow, her heart tearing with every word. "My people in Brittany will pay the price. Henry will see it as a declaration of war. I would be trading their safety for my own happiness. I cannot do that." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "I am the bridge between two kingdoms, Thomas, and a bridge cannot choose its own direction. It can only bear the weight." The truth of her words settled between them, heavy and suffocating. There was no escape. Her dark night of the soul had arrived, and she was utterly alone in her choice. Love or duty, her heart or her people. Thomas looked at her, his own hope dying in his eyes. He saw the iron will beneath her sorrow, the queen beneath the heartbroken girl. He understood. His sacrifice would be to let her make hers. He could not save her from her fate, but he could save her from the scandal of their love. "Then I will take the position in France," he said, his voice rough with unshed tears. He released her arms, and the cold rushed in where his warmth had been. "I will leave before the wedding. No one will ever know." He turned to walk away, his figure a dark shape against the tormented sky. Each step he took away from her was a note in a funeral dirge, the final breaking chord of their song. Dawn broke cold and grey over Hampton Court, the pale light filtering through the stained glass of the royal chapel like a final hesitant blessing. Anne found Thomas there, just as she knew she would. He was not praying, but standing in the centre of the nave, his travelling cloak already fastened. A groom waited with 2 horses in the courtyard beyond, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their hooves echoing her own frantic heartbeat. "You weren't going to say goodbye," she said, her voice echoing in the sacred silence. It was not an accusation, but a statement of painful fact. He turned, his face etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have aged him overnight. "A goodbye would only make the leaving impossible," he admitted. "It is kinder this way." "No," she said, stepping closer. "The kindest thing is the truth." She took a deep breath, gathering the strength she had forged in the crucible of her grief. "I am going to marry Prince Arthur. I am going to be Queen of England. But I did not simply surrender, Thomas. I went to the king. I negotiated." A flicker of surprise, of pride crossed his face. "I will fulfill my duties," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But I have secured a promise. My own household, my own musicians, a measure of control over my own affairs. I will not be a silent broodmare in a golden cage. I will have a voice. You taught me to find it." He understood then. It was not the ending they had dreamed of in the tower room, but it was not a complete defeat. She had not run away, but she had not broken either. She had found a third path, a path of duty infused with dignity. They could not have forever, but they had created something true, something that had changed them both irrevocably. "Your song," he whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You will not forget it." "Never," she promised, "nor yours." For their final farewell there were no more words. He retrieved his lute from a nearby pew. She took a small silver flute from a hidden pocket in her cloak, and there, in the empty chapel at dawn, they played. It was their final duet. He began with his English ballad, the melody of heartbreaking loss. Then she joined in, weaving the notes of her mother's Breton lullaby around his. The 2 melodies, one of sorrow, one of comfort, one of England, one of Brittany, twined together, creating a new harmony, a song that was uniquely theirs, a testament to a love that could find beauty even in the face of impossible difference. When the last perfect note faded, they simply looked at each other, their music having said everything. He bowed, a gesture of profound respect, and walked out of the chapel without looking back, 5 years later. The bells of London tolled, but this time they were for the death of a king. Anne, now the Queen Mother, a young widow after Arthur's untimely passing, stood on the balcony watching the solemn procession. She was a respected figure, known for her wisdom, her quiet strength, and her patronage of the arts. She had kept her promise to her people and to herself. That evening a package arrived, delivered by a messenger who had travelled far. It bore no name, only a seal of pressed wildflowers. Inside, nestled in silk, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a lark poised for flight. Beneath it lay a sheaf of sheet music. The melody was new, yet achingly familiar. It was a continuation of their song, filled with longing, but also with a deep, abiding peace. Alone in her chambers, Anne went to her clavichord. As her fingers found the keys, the melody filled the room, a sound that transcended time and circumstance. Some songs are meant to be sung once, in perfect harmony, their echo lasting longer than a lifetime of ordinary music. Anne closed her eyes, a small secret smile on her lips, and let the melody carry her back to a love that chose memory over possession, duty over desire, and in that choice found its own form of forever. The Venetian Masquerade, Beneath the Golden Mask. The last vestiges of twilight bled across the Grand Canal, painting the rippling water in hues of bruised violet and fading gold. From her window in the Palazzo di Rossi, Alessandra watched the city she loved, a jewel box of flickering lanterns and distant, echoing laughter, slowly begin its nightly performance. The air, thick with the damp, ancient scent of stone and sea, carried the faint, jubilant strains of carnival music, a sound that felt more like a taunt than an invitation. It was a melody of freedom, a world away from the gilded cage of her existence. Her gaze drifted from the canal to the portrait that dominated the far wall of her chambers. Her mother, captured in oils and eternal grace, smiled a gentle, knowing smile. Alessandra moved toward it, her silk dressing gown whispering against the cool marble floor. Her fingers, trembling slightly, reached out to touch a worn, folded letter, tucked into the corner of the ornate frame. It was her father's final confession, not of sins, but of figures, a ledger of debts detailed in cold, merciless numbers. A lifetime of reckless wagers and failed ventures had left their noble name hanging by a thread now woven into her betrothal. "Forgive me, Mamma," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing in the cavernous silence. "I know you married for love. It was the one true fortune you possessed." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a hot, defiant drop against her cool skin. Her mother had been a merchant's daughter, married into nobility for a heart full of passion, not a coffer full of ducats. Now, Alessandra was expected to do the opposite, to sell her future to save their past. The weight of her mother's pearl necklace, a wedding gift she now wore daily, felt less like an heirloom and more like a manacle. Each iridescent sphere was a reminder of the life she was being forced to accept, a life bound to Conte Marcello. He was a man whose presence chilled the air, whose eyes appraised her not with affection, but with the cool, detached assessment of a merchant weighing goods. During his last visit, his touch had been a proprietary caress on her arm, his fingers cold and firm staking a claim. He spoke of alliances, of consolidating power, of the Rossi name being polished anew under his patronage. He never spoke of her, only of what she represented, a beautiful, well-bred key to the upper echelons of Venetian society he so desperately craved to unlock. Alessandra's reflection shimmered back at her from the darkened window pane, a pale, captive ghost. Dark hair, eyes the colour of Venetian dusk, a mouth that had forgotten the shape of a genuine smile. She saw the resignation settling in her features, the slow extinguishing of a light she once believed was unquenchable. Her lady's maid, Sophia, had laid out the fabrics for her wedding trousseau earlier that day. Creamy silks, gossamer thin lace, seed pearls like tiny frozen tears. They were beautiful, exquisite, the trappings of a gilded sacrifice. 3 days until the masquerade ball, her mind chanted, a grim litany. 3 days until my last night of anonymity. 3 days until I become someone else's possession. The ball was to be her final public appearance as Alessandra de Rossi, the unmarried daughter of a fading house. The next time Venice saw her, she would be the Contessa Marcello, her identity subsumed, her spirit shackled. A sudden, fierce rebellion surged through her veins, a hot, cleansing fire. It was a spark ignited by her mother's portrait, by the memory of stories of a love so potent it had defied convention. What was the point of honouring her father's memory by condemning herself to a loveless future? The debts were his, the shame his. Yet she was the one being asked to pay the price. The injustice of it was a bitter pill she could no longer swallow. She wouldn't just attend the masquerade, she would inhabit it. For one night she would not be Alessandra de Rossi, the dutiful daughter, the bartered bride. She would be a mystery, a fleeting dream, a creature of the Venetian night. She would dance with strangers, drink the forbidden wine of freedom, and breathe the air of a life she might have lived. It was a foolish, dangerous idea, a final, flickering act of defiance before the darkness closed in. Crossing the room, she opened a heavy cedar-lined chest at the foot of her bed. Beneath layers of linens and stored memories lay a box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a mask. It was a gift from her mother, from a time when carnival was a celebration, not a countdown to captivity. The mask was a masterpiece of gilded papier-mâché, shaped into the visage of a phoenix, its feathered crest sweeping elegantly upwards, its eyes holding a hint of both sorrow and fire. The golden surface was intricately detailed, catching the candlelight and throwing fractured, dancing patterns across her face as she lifted it. Her mother had called it her mask of courage. "When you feel caged, my little phoenix," she had said, her voice a warm melody, "remember that you have wings. You can always be reborn from the ashes." Alessandra held the mask to her face. Staring at her reflection now, she saw not a ghost, but a flicker of possibility. A woman she didn't recognize, a stranger with fire in her eyes. The melancholy that had clouded her heart began to recede, replaced by a desperate, electric yearning. One night to be the phoenix, one night to soar before her wings were clipped for good. The decision settled not with a sense of peace, but with the thrilling, terrifying hum of a drawn bowstring waiting to be released. The grand ballroom of the Palazzo Grimani was a living kaleidoscope and a riot of sensation that overwhelmed and intoxicated in equal measure. Music from a string quartet swelled and swirled, a Viennese waltz that swept through the cavernous space, catching the rustle of silk gowns and the whisper of secrets shared behind feathered fans and jewelled masks. Towering Murano glass chandeliers dripped light like liquid diamonds, casting a glittering, ethereal glow upon the throng of disguised nobility. The air was a heady perfume of melting wax, expensive florals, and the collective, anonymous thrill of the masquerade. Alessandra, clad in a gown of deep crimson that felt as bold and defiant as her mood, moved through the crowd like a phantom. Her golden phoenix mask, her shield and her liberation hid the nervous flutter in her heart. Here, she was no one's daughter, no one's fiancée. She was simply a shape in the crowd, a flash of gold and crimson, a mystery waiting to be unravelled. She watched Conte Marcello from across the room, his peacock-like ostentation on full display as he held court with a group of older, influential men. He wore a simple black domino mask, but it did little to hide the predatory glint in his eyes. He scanned the room, and for a terrifying moment his gaze seemed to snag on her, but it slid past, unrecognising. A shiver of relief, cold and sharp, ran down her spine. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant, the bubbles a fizz of courage on her tongue. She was content to be an observer, a wallflower drinking in this last taste of life. But the music was a siren's call, and a profound loneliness began to ache within her, a longing to be part of the dance, not just a witness to it. It was then that he appeared, a figure emerging from the crush of bodies as if summoned by her unspoken wish. He was tall, his presence a pocket of stillness in the swirling chaos. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored coat of midnight blue velvet, and his mask was the same deep hue, unadorned save for a subtle silver filigree at the temples. It concealed the upper half of his face, but couldn't hide the strength of his jaw or the way his mouth curved into a faint, intriguing smile as he stopped before her. "A phoenix, signora?" His voice was a low baritone, a smooth, rich sound with an accent she couldn't quite place. Not Italian, something crisper, cleaner. How prophetic. Are you planning on rising from the ashes of this rather dull affair? Alessandra felt a jolt, a spark of connection that was as unexpected as it was potent. His directness was a refreshing breeze in the stuffy air of polite veiled conversation. "Perhaps, Messere," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "Or perhaps I am simply admiring the flames before they consume everything." His smile deepened. "A poet as well as a prophetess. In that case, would you grant a mere mortal one dance before the conflagration?" He extended a hand. It was ungloved, strong and steady. She placed her hand in his, and the moment their skin touched, a current warm and electric arced between them. It was a shocking, intimate jolt in this room full of carefully constructed barriers. He led her onto the dance floor, and as the quartet slid into a new melody, they began to move. He was a masterful dancer, guiding her with a quiet confidence that was both commanding and gentle. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their steps were a conversation, their movements a perfect, unspoken harmony. It felt less like a dance and more like a recognition, a meeting of two souls who'd been moving to the same rhythm long before they ever touched. She found herself studying the details of him, the way a lock of dark, wavy hair fell across his brow, the clean, sharp scent of bergamot and sea salt that clung to him, a fragrance that spoke of ships and faraway lands. With every turn, every stolen glance, the tension between them coiled tighter, a silken cord of intoxicating attraction. This was more than a dance. It was a discovery. "You are not from Venice," she stated, her voice soft, meant only for him. "Is my accent so obvious?" he murmured, his lips close to her ear, sending another shiver through her. "I am English. A diplomat of a sort. My name is Gabriel." Gabriel. The name suited him. He spoke it simply, without title or fanfare. A British diplomat. The word sent a prickle of alarm through her. England and Venice were tangled in a web of shifting alliances and trade disputes. He was not just a foreigner, he was a potential adversary, a man her future husband would surely see as a threat. The knowledge should have made her pull away, but instead it added a dangerous, thrilling edge to their encounter. He was everything forbidden, everything she should avoid. When the music finally softened to a close, they stood for a moment, breathless, their hands still linked in the centre of the glittering ballroom. The noise and the motion of the crowd seemed to fade into a distant hum. Reality, with its sharp edges and cold obligations, was beginning to press in. "The air in here has grown thick," Gabriel said, his gaze intense. "There is a balcony overlooking the canal. Would you join me for a moment of quiet?" She gave a single decisive nod. He didn't release her hand, but instead threaded his fingers through hers. A bold and possessive gesture that made her heart leap. He led her away from the dance floor, through a set of French doors, and out into the cool, moon-drenched night. They were alone. The music was a muted whisper behind them, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the palazzo's stone foundations, and the frantic beating of her own heart. The moonlight silvered the edges of his mask, casting his mouth and jaw in sharp relief. Slowly, as if asking for permission, he reached up with his free hand and gently untied the ribbon of his mask, letting it fall away. His eyes, now revealed, were a startling clear blue, the colour of the sea on a winter's morning. They were kind eyes, yet they held a deep melancholic wisdom, as if they had witnessed more sorrow than a man his age should know. And, his gaze fixed on her mask, he lifted his hand to her face. His touch was feather-light, hesitant, a stark contrast to Marcello's cold possession. With a shared breath, he reached for the ribbons of her phoenix mask. The world seemed to stop as he slowly, carefully, began to untie the knot, preparing to reveal the woman behind the golden facade. The golden phoenix mask slipped from her face, and in the pearlescent moonlight, Alessandra felt utterly, terrifyingly exposed. The cool night air kissed her skin, a startling sensation after the warmth and anonymity of her disguise. Gabriel's sea-blue eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw not the disappointment or calculation she might have expected, but a look of profound, almost reverent recognition. He didn't know her name, but he saw her. "Alessandra," she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her own lips after a night of being nobody. "Alessandra," he repeated, his voice a soft caress. "It's beautiful." He didn't release her, but instead let his thumb trace the delicate line of her jaw, a touch so tender it made her tremble. "Your mask was of a phoenix, now I see why. There is fire in you." Before she could fashion a reply, he gestured toward a stone bench in a hidden alcove of the Grimani Gardens, shrouded by overgrown jasmine vines whose white blossoms perfumed the air with a cloyingly sweet scent. They sat, the city's distant revelry a mere murmur. The quiet felt more intimate than any crowded ballroom. He told her he was a British diplomat tasked with investigating whispers of corruption in the Venetian trade routes, a rot that threatened to poison relations with England. "I came to Venice for duty, Alessandra," he confessed, his gaze fixed on the dark, shimmering water of the canal. "I never expected to find my soul." The raw honesty of his words unlatched a door in her own heart. The carefully constructed walls of duty and resignation began to crumble. "And I," she began, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know it possessed, "came to this ball for one last night of freedom. In 2 days I am to be married." She didn't say to whom. She didn't want to taint this perfect stolen moment with Marcello's name. But the weight of the admission hung between them, heavy and cold. Gabriel's hand, which had been resting near hers on the bench, covered her own. His warmth was a small, solid anchor in the swirling tide of her emotions. "To a man you love?" he asked, his voice gentle, devoid of judgment. Alessandra laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Love is a currency my family can no longer afford. It is a political arrangement to secure my family's name." A shared silence fell, filled with the unspoken understanding of loss and sacrifice. He told her of his older brother, a naval officer lost to a cannonball in a skirmish with French privateers. "He was the brave one," Gabriel said, a shadow passing over his handsome features. "I have spent my life trying to live up to his ghost, shackling myself to duty as a way to honour his sacrifice. I believed it was my penance, that my touch destroys what I love." In turn, she spoke of her parents, of their passionate whirlwind love that had been the talk of Venice, and of the slow, tragic decline after her mother's death from a sudden fever. Her father, lost in his grief, had gambled away their legacy, chasing the ghost of a happiness he could never recapture. Their stories, though born of different circumstances, resonated with the same painful chord of love and loss. It was as if they were two halves of the same fractured soul, finding their missing piece on a moonlit balcony in Venice. "How can 3 hours feel like a lifetime, yet pass like a heartbeat?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Because some moments are a lifetime," he answered, turning to face her fully. He suggested a gondola, a desire to escape the palace grounds entirely, to steal a few more moments from the relentless march of time. They found a lone gondolier dozing near a small private dock, and soon they were gliding through the city's liquid labyrinth. Away from the grandeur of the Grand Canal, the smaller waterways were quiet, mysterious, flanked by the sleeping faces of ancient palazzos. The only sounds were the gentle splash of the gondolier's oar and the distant haunting melody of a lone singer somewhere in the night. The gondola slipped into the narrow channel leading toward the Bridge of Sighs. The enclosed bridge loomed above them, a dark, poetic link between the Doge's palace and the prison. Legend claimed that lovers who kissed in a gondola beneath it at sunset would be granted eternal love. but under the stark silver light of the moon it felt more poignant, a place of endings and the beginnings. As they passed into the shadow of the bridge, the gondola slowed. Gabriel reached out, his fingers gently cupping her face. The world narrowed the space between them. The moonlight, the water, the distant music, it all faded away, leaving only the intensity of his gaze. He leaned in and she met him halfway, a silent, mutual surrender. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, then deepening with a passion that mirrored the desperate, aching longing in her own soul. It was not the chaste, passionless kiss of a betrothed couple. It was a kiss of discovery, of hunger, of two people finding a home in one another. It was a kiss that tasted of champagne and salt and bittersweet possibilities. It was a promise and a heartbreak all at once, a perfect, impossible moment suspended in time. As their lips parted, the first hint of dawn was bruising the eastern sky, a pale, pearly grey that threatened to shatter their nocturnal spell. The magic was dissolving, the beautiful illusion giving way to the cold, hard light of day. Reality, with its impending wedding and political duties, was no longer a distant threat but an imminent, crushing certainty. The spell was breaking, and the ache in Alessandra's chest was the sound of her heart tearing in two. The chiming of the clock in the Piazza San Marco was a relentless metallic heartbeat, each hour a nail in the coffin of Alessandra's freedom. Dawn had broken, stripping the magic from the Venetian night and leaving behind a stark, unforgiving reality. Her wedding was tomorrow. In her chambers, Sophia moved with a sombre reverence, laying out the ivory silk of her wedding dress. The gown, which had once seemed merely beautiful, now looked like a shroud. Its intricate lacework was a web, its train a chain. Alessandra stared at it, her body numb, her mind still replaying the kiss beneath the Bridge of Sighs, the feel of Gabriel's hand in hers, the impossible hope he had ignited. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office near the Rialto Bridge, Gabriel's world was also unravelling. His investigation had borne bitter fruit. Poring over shipping manifests and intercepted letters by the light of a sputtering candle, he had found the linchpin of the corruption, the Venetian nobleman secretly funneling information and diverting British cargo for his own profit. The name on the documents, signed with an arrogant flourish, made his blood run cold: Conte Marcello. The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow. This was not just a political matter anymore. The man who held Alessandra's future in his cold, calculating hands was a traitor and a thief. Gabriel's love for her had now become politically dangerous, a liability that could not only jeopardize his mission, but could place Alessandra in the direct path of Marcello's wrath. If the Conte discovered their connection, he would not hesitate to use her, to crush her, to ensure her silence. The thought of his love bringing her harm was a torment worse than any penance he had ever imagined. His instinct, honed by years of duty and the guilt from his brother's death, screamed at him to protect her by disappearing from her life. His choice felt like a betrayal of his own soul, but he saw no other way. He began to burn the few mementos from their night together. A dried jasmine blossom from the garden, a sketch he'd made of her phoenix mask from memory. He watched the paper curl and blacken, the image of her vanishing into smoke. It was a sacrifice, he told himself, for her safety. He penned a formal report to his superiors in London, and a separate, hastily scribbled note to Alessandra, a note filled with agonizingly vague apologies, and a promise that his actions were for her own good. He booked passage on a merchant ship leaving for England on the evening tide. That afternoon, Conte Marcello paid a visit. He found Alessandra in the Palazzo's formal salon, her face pale, her eyes hollow. He mistook her despair for bridal nerves. "Soon, my dear," he said, his voice slick with satisfaction. "All of Venice will envy you. Your family's name will be restored, polished to a brighter sheen than ever before." He took her hand, his touch possessive. "You are a wise woman to accept your duty. Refuse me and your family's name dies with your father's debts. Your father's legacy will be one of shame, whispered in every corner of the city. The threat was veiled, but the malice behind it was crystal clear. He was not her saviour, he was her jailer. As Sophia helped her into the wedding dress for a final fitting, something inside Alessandra snapped. The silk felt coarse against her skin, the veil a suffocating cloud. This wasn't duty, it was erasure. This wasn't saving her family's name, it was destroying her own soul. As Sophia turned to fetch her pearls, Alessandra reached up, her hand shaking with a furious energy, and tore the gossamer veil from her hair. The sound of ripping silk was a cry of rebellion, a sound of liberation. Just then, a street urchin, bribed by a handsome coin, delivered Gabriel's note. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The words were a dagger to her heart. "Forgive me, I must leave Venice. It is the only way to keep you safe." Safe? He thought a life with Marcello was safety. He thought a gilded cage was preferable to a shared risk. He was choosing for her, just as her father had, just as Marcello had. He was repeating the mistakes of his past, trying to protect someone by pushing them away, by silencing their voice in their own destiny. A desperate, defiant fire raged through her. She would not be a passive victim in her own story. She would not let him sacrifice their potential for a misguided sense of honour. Ripping off the suffocating bodice of the wedding gown, she threw on a simple dark cloak, her movements frantic and purposeful. She had to find him. She flew from the palazzo, a shadow moving through the labyrinthine streets of Venice as dusk began to fall. She ran through crowded campers and down deserted alleyways, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't know where his ship was docked, but she ran toward the sea, toward the smell of salt and tar, her only guide a desperate hope. She found him on a remote quay, his silhouette stark against the fading light, about to board a small tender that would take him to the anchored ship. "Gabriel," she cried, her voice raw. He turned, his face a mask of shock and anguish. "Alessandra, you shouldn't be here." "Don't you dare choose for me," she gasped, rushing to him, her hands gripping the front of his coat. Her eyes, wild with passion and fury, blazed up at him. "You speak of duty and safety, but you know nothing of it. Safety is not a life without love. It's a prison. If our love is dangerous, if we are to be destroyed, then let it be a fate we choose together, not one you impose upon me." Her words struck him with the force of truth, shattering his carefully constructed rationale. In her eyes, he saw not a woman who needed his protection, but an equal, a warrior willing to fight for their future. He saw the fire of the phoenix, and he finally understood. Protecting her didn't mean leaving her. It meant standing with her. "The consequences," he started, his voice thick with emotion. "Damn the consequences," she whispered, her hands moving to cup his face. "Damn the debts, and the duty, and the ghosts of our past. Choose me, Gabriel. Choose us." In that moment, standing on the edge of the dark, whispering water, with the city of masks and secrets behind them, he made the only choice that mattered. He pulled her into his arms, his kiss a desperate, fierce confirmation. They would flee, together. Whatever the price, they would pay it side by side. 1 month later, the sound that woke Alessandra was not the chiming of a clock or the distant cry of a gondolier, but the gentle rhythmic sigh of waves washing over a sandy shore. Seabirds called to one another in the bright, clean air. She opened her eyes to a room filled with sunlight, the salty breeze rustling the simple linen curtains of a window that looked out not onto a canal, but onto the vast, brilliant expanse of the Adriatic Sea. Gabriel was sitting at a small wooden desk, the morning light catching the gold in his dark hair as he wrote. They had found refuge in a secluded villa on the coast, a place far from the gilded cages and shadowy politics of Venice. Their escape had been a frantic, desperate affair, a blur of secret passages and moonless nights, facilitated by one of Gabriel's loyal contacts. In the weeks that followed, they had lived simply, their world shrinking to the confines of the small house and the endless sea. It was a world built not on legacy or obligation, but on stolen moments and a shared, quiet joy. Gabriel sealed the letter he was writing and turned, a warm smile spreading across his face as he saw she was awake. He crossed the room and handed her a different letter, one that had arrived the previous day by diplomatic pouch, its seal bearing the crest of the British monarchy. "It's over, cara mia," he said softly, his voice full of a relief so profound it was almost tangible. Her hands trembled as she read. Gabriel's report on Conte Marcello, sent before their flight, had been corroborated by other sources. An investigation had been launched, and the full extent of the Conte's treasonous dealings had been exposed. He was ruined, his assets seized by the Venetian council, his name now a synonym for disgrace. But the letter contained another, more startling revelation. In their investigation, the authorities had uncovered Marcello's predatory financial dealings, including the unjust terms of the arrangement he had forced upon her father. The Rossi debts were declared void, a product of criminal coercion. Her family's honour, the very thing she had been forced to sacrifice herself for, had been restored not by her marriage, but by the truth. Tears welled in Alessandra's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a dizzying, overwhelming gratitude. They had not destroyed her family. They had, in a strange, circuitous way, saved it. "Love isn't about finding someone you can live with, cara mia," Gabriel whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Someone you cannot live without." He knelt beside the bed, taking her hand in his. "I spent so long believing I was destined to live a life of penance. You taught me that true honour lies not in solitary sacrifice, but in the courage to build a life with the person who holds your heart." Later that day, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they were married. There was no priest, no audience, no silken gown or string quartet. Their ceremony took place on the beach at sunrise, witnessed only by the sea and the sky. Alessandra wore a simple white sundress, and Gabriel a plain linen shirt. They exchanged simple hand-forged iron rings, their vows a quiet promise whispered over the sound of the waves. It was honest and real and more sacred than any cathedral ceremony could ever have been. In their small villa, her golden phoenix mask now hung in the window. It was no longer a symbol of a desperate final flight, but a testament to their rebirth. Each morning it caught the sun's rays, scattering prisms of light across the room, a daily reminder of the night their two worlds collided. She was no longer the caged bird, and he was no longer the lonely diplomat bound by ghosts. They were simply Alessandra and Gabriel. She stood with him on the cliffside overlooking the water, his arms securely around her waist. His evidence and diplomatic service had earned him not a reprimand, but a pardon and a new, less perilous posting in England. They would sail tomorrow, toward a new life, a future they would write themselves. "Some say we lost everything," Alessandra thought, leaning her head against his shoulder as they watched a ship sail toward the horizon. A title, a palazzo, a place in Venetian society, but how can it be lost when you've gained your soul? They held each other, their new wedding rings catching the last brilliant rays of the setting sun. They had navigated the labyrinthine canals of duty and deception and emerged into the clear, open waters of truth. They had learned that the greatest masquerade isn't the mask you wear to a ball, but the inauthentic life you accept out of fear. Theirs was a love forged in secrets and starlight, a love that had dared to choose courage over comfort. And as the Venetian dusk once more painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, their quiet laughter, a melody of hard-won peace, was carried out to sea two souls who had risked everything and in doing so had gained it all. beneath the broken sky. The sky didn't just weep, it raged. Jake Mitchell had spent half his life in the air, a nomad of the jet stream, but he'd never seen a storm like this. It was a living, breathing monster, a churning vortex of black cloud and horizontal rain that clawed at his helicopter with savage intent. Below, the world had dissolved into a brown, churning sea, a landscape of flooded countryside where rooftops poked through the surface like lonely gravestones. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Rescue 1!" he'd yelled into the radio minutes ago, his voice swallowed by a roar of static. "Engine failure! I'm going down!" There was no response. There was only the wind's deafening shriek and the sickening groan of the rotor blades losing their fight. He was a man who saved people, plucking them from the jaws of disaster. Now the jaws were closing on him. He scanned the deluge for a patch of solid ground, anything that wasn't submerged. A sliver of gold, a wheat field, miraculously spared on a slight rise, appeared through the grey sheet of rain. He aimed for it, his hands moving with the ingrained memory of 1,000 drills. The controls felt sluggish, a dying animal in his grip. He braced for impact. The landing was less a landing and more a controlled fall. Metal screamed as the skids hit the soft earth, digging deep, sending mud and wheat stalks flying. The helicopter tilted, a wounded beast collapsing onto its side. The main rotor blade, already fractured, snapped with a sound like a giant's bone breaking, scything through the air before embedding itself in the saturated ground. Jake's head slammed against the side window, glass spider-webbed, then shattered. The world dissolved into a concussive flash of white, then a profound, ringing silence. The storm for a moment was muted. Sarah Michaels had been watching the storm from her farmhouse window, 10-year-old Tommy a silent, anxious presence beside her. The lights had flickered and died an hour ago, plunging them into a world of candlelight and shadows. Every roll of thunder was a physical blow, vibrating through the old floorboards and up her spine. It was a familiar fear, a ghost from her childhood that the rumbling sky always resurrected. Then she saw it, a dark shape tumbling from the bruised heavens. Not a bird. Something mechanical, something failing. It disappeared behind the stand of ancient oaks that bordered her property. The crash was a muffled, percussive thud that was felt as much as heard. "Stay here," she told Tommy, her voice steadier than her hands. "But what was it?" he asked, his eyes wide in the flickering gloom. "I don't know, but you're not going out there." She pulled on her rubber boots and a heavy raincoat, grabbing the largest flashlight she could find. The wind ripped the kitchen door from her hand, slamming it against the exterior wall. Rain, cold and stinging, plastered her hair to her face. She fought her way toward the oaks, mud sucking at her boots. The sight of the mangled helicopter in her wheat field was surreal. It looked like a fallen god, its metallic skin gleaming wetly in the intermittent flashes of lightning. A strange, almost sacred silence hung over the wreckage. As she drew closer, she saw the shattered cockpit, and inside a man slumped and unmoving. Tommy appeared at her elbow, his small face pale. "Mom, is he—" "I told you to stay inside," she snapped, then immediately softened, pulling him into her side. "I'm sorry." "Go back to the house, please, Tommy. It's not safe." He hesitated, then obeyed, his small figure swallowed by the storm. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She circled the wreck, her flashlight beam cutting through the rain. The pilot's door was jammed shut. She found a rock slick with rainwater, and after a moment's hesitation, she smashed the remaining glass of the side window, clearing a path. The man was wedged in his seat, a dark gash on his forehead painting his temple crimson. His flight suit was torn, his breathing shallow. She reached in, her fingers trembling as she pressed them against his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady, a thrum of life in the midst of all this chaos. We can't leave him, she thought, a whisper in her own mind. Somehow she unbuckled him. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked her arms under his and pulled, dragging him through the broken window frame, away from the smell of fuel and rain. He groaned, a low, guttural sound that was the first sign of consciousness. By the time she had him halfway to the farmhouse, Tommy was there again, a small, determined soldier in the face of the storm, helping her pull. They laid him on the braided rug in front of the cold fireplace. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in a stark blue-white strobe. The unconscious pilot, the terrified boy, and the woman who had pulled a man from the sky. Jake awoke slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. The first thing he registered was the scent of lavender soap. The second was a gentle, rhythmic pressure on his forehead. He blinked, his vision swimming. A warm, golden light pulsed softly. Candles. A woman's face hovered above him, etched with concern, her dark hair falling in damp tendrils around her shoulders. She was cleaning the cut on his head with a soft cloth, her touch as precise and delicate as a watchmaker's. Outside, the storm still howled, the rain drumming a relentless tattoo against old window panes. The chaos outside was a perfect mirror for the roaring confusion in his chest. His voice was a dry rasp. You saved my life." She looked up from her work, her eyes, the colour of rich dark earth, meeting his. A small sad smile touched her lips. The storm did the rest. Morning arrived not with a bang but with a whisper. Pale, watery sunlight filtered through the streaked kitchen windows, painting dusty motes of gold in the air. Jake woke to the soft, rhythmic turning of a page. He was on a sofa, a thick, hand-stitched quilt tucked around him. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but the world had settled back onto its axis. Across the room in a worn armchair sat Tommy, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read a book, his feet dangling inches from the floor. The sight of the boy's quiet innocence was a balm, a stark contrast to the adrenaline and danger that had defined Jake's life for as long as he could remember. It reminded him, with a sudden sharp pang, of everything he had lost, or rather, everything he had never allowed himself to have. The smell of coffee, rich and inviting, drew his attention to the kitchen. Sarah stood at the counter, her movements practiced and graceful as she poured hot water over fresh grounds in a ceramic dripper. She wore a simple grey sweater, her hair tied back, and in the gentle morning light she looked less like the storm-soaked rescuer from the night before and more like a figure from a half-forgotten dream of peace. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft. "How's your head?" "Like a drum solo," he admitted, slowly sitting up. The quilt smelled of cedar and something faintly floral. Home, the word ambushed him. "Thank you for everything." "It's either that or leave you to rust in the fields," she replied, a hint of dry humour in her tone. She handed him a steaming mug. The ceramic was warm against his palms. "Tommy's father left 3 years ago. He's not used to having a man around the house, especially one who falls out of the sky." The statement was delivered simply, a fact laid bare without drama, yet the word "left" hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. It was an echo of her own fear. Tommy, sensing the shift in conversation, looked up. "Are you a real pilot?" Jake managed a smile. "Most days. Yesterday, I was more of a professional crash tester." He took a sip of coffee. It was strong. Perfect. "What are you reading?" "The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe," Tommy said, holding up the book. "Mum's making me do a report. I have math homework too, but I hate fractions." An hour later, Jake found himself at the sturdy oak kitchen table, a pencil in his hand, explaining how to find a common denominator. He discovered a surprising patience within himself. a gentle corner of his soul he rarely accessed. He saw the way Sarah watched them, a tentative curiosity in her eyes as she graded papers at the other end of the panel. He was a stranger, a piece of wreckage from a violent world. Yet here, in this sun-dappled kitchen, he felt a sense of belonging that was both foreign and deeply seductive. Later that afternoon, Sarah led him outside. The air was clean, washed new by the storm. The floodwaters had receded slightly, leaving behind a slick of mud and debris. She showed him her garden, a patch of earth behind the house. Last year's floods had nearly wiped it out, she explained, but she had rebuilt the raised beds, fortified the soil, and replanted. Tomato vines, heavy with green fruit, climbed their stakes. Rows of lettuce and kale stood in neat, resilient lines. It was a testament to her tenacity, a living metaphor for her refusal to be washed away. "It's not much," she said, her hands brushing against a fragrant rosemary bush, "but it's mine, something to nurture." She had dirt under her fingernails, a smudge of it on her cheek. Jake found it beautiful. That evening a fire crackled in the hearth, warding off the damp chill that had settled in after the rain. Tommy was asleep upstairs. The house was quiet, wrapped in a blanket of rural silence broken only by the snap of burning logs. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Sarah asked, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Of saving people? The chaos?" Jake thought for a long moment, the firelight playing over his rugged features. "I've never known anything else," he admitted, his voice low. "My father was in the army. We moved every 2 years. I never learned how to plant things. I've never stayed anywhere long enough to watch anything grow." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and filled with a raw honesty that startled them both. It was a confession, an admission of a different kind of emptiness. Sarah's expression softened with an understanding that went beyond words. "Do you ever get tired of being left behind?" The question was a quiet echo of his own, a vulnerable offering from her own guarded heart. It wasn't an accusation, but a shared acknowledgement of their parallel scars. He, the man who always left. She, the woman who was always left. In the warm, flickering silence that followed, something shifted. The space between them, once filled with the caution of strangers, was now charged with the fragile, powerful current of recognition. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. The world outside the flooded valley ceased to exist. Power was still out, the roads impassable. For Jake, it was the longest he'd been grounded in over a decade. He fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the farmhouse. He spent his days making repairs, the rhythmic thud of his hammer against the damaged roof a steady counterpoint to the drone of Sarah teaching Tommy his lessons at the kitchen table. Their conversations flowed as easily as the creek that bordered the property, meandering from trivial topics to deeper currents of their lives. He told her about the places he'd been, the earthquake zones, the hurricane-ravaged coasts, and she spoke of the small town she'd never left, of the joys and challenges of moulding young minds. They were two halves of a whole he'd never known existed, the adventurer and the nurturer, the sky and the earth. With every shared glance, every lingering touch as they passed in a doorway, the magnetic pull between them grew stronger, an invisible tide rising in the quiet corners of the house. On the third afternoon, as Jake was securing a loose shutter, Tommy approached him, his small face serious. "Are you going to leave like my dad?" The question was a stone dropped into a still pond, its ripples expanding to touch both adults. Jake stopped hammering, his gaze finding Sarah's across the yard. He saw the familiar flinch in her eyes, the tightening of her jaw. This was the question that haunted her waking moments. I don't know, kiddo," Jake answered honestly, kneeling to be at the boy's level. "My job is out there." He gestured vaguely at the wide open sky. "My dad's job was out there too," Tommy said quietly, before turning and running back toward the house. The exchange left a palpable tension in the air, a storm cloud of a different kind gathering on the horizon. Later, as dusk settled, casting long shadows across the living room, Sarah sought to explain. She retrieved a small silver-framed photograph from the mantelpiece and handed it to Jake. It showed a young girl with a bright, hopeful eyes, standing next to a man in a pilot's uniform. The man was handsome, beaming with pride, his arm wrapped protectively around his daughter. "My father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a crop duster. He loved the sky more than anything. When I was 12, his plane went down in a storm not unlike the one the other night. They said it was mechanical failure. Suddenly, everything clicked into place for Jake. Her fear of the thunder, the way she'd flinched when a lone military cargo plane had passed high overhead yesterday. Her deep-seated terror wasn't just of abandonment. It was a specific, visceral fear of losing someone she loved to the very thing he considered his domain. The sky was his sanctuary and her graveyard. "Sarah," he began, his voice thick with a new understanding. He set the photograph down gently. "I'm not him." She looked at him, her beautiful guarded eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "How can I believe that?" she whispered, the question a raw, desperate plea. "You live in the clouds. Your whole life is about flying into the heart of the storm. How can I not be terrified of watching you fly away one way or another?" He had no answer for that. Duty was etched into his soul, a part of his identity. But in that moment, looking at her, he felt that identity cracking. He saw a future he'd never dared to imagine, one rooted in soil and sunlight, not wind and altitude. He stepped closer, closing the space between them. The air grew thick, electric. He could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, see the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. The distant rumble of another approaching storm mimicked the thunder in his own chest. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently cupping her cheek. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as if in surrender. The kiss wasn't a gentle exploration. It was a collision. It was soft and desperate, hungry and full of a profound, aching tenderness. It was the frantic culmination of 3 days of unspoken longing, a release of the tension that had been coiling between them since the moment she'd pulled him from the wreckage. It was the taste of coffee and rain, of fear and hope. For Jake, it felt like landing after a lifetime in freefall. For Sarah, it felt like a terrifying, beautiful leap of faith. It was a silent promise, full of all the words they were too afraid to say, sealed in the charged quiet as the first drops of a new storm began to fall. The kiss had broken something open, a dam of restraint and fear. But as the new storm rolled in, more ferocious than the last, reality came crashing back with it. The battery-powered radio, their only link to the outside world, crackled to life with a terrifying urgency. Mandatory evacuation for all residents in the Cedar Valley. Repeat, this is a mandatory evacuation. The Northwood Dam has sustained critical damage. Structural failure is imminent. The valley is expected to flood within the next 4 hours. The robotic voice filled the small farmhouse, a harbinger of doom. Sarah's face went white. She looked out the window at the creek, already swollen and angry, its muddy water churning. This wasn't just a flood, it was an inundation. "We have to go," Jake said, his pilot-in-command voice taking over. "Now! Pack a bag. Essentials only." As if summoned by his words, the radio squawked again, but this time it was a familiar voice cutting through the static. "Rescue 1, this is Search Command. Jake, do you copy? We have a visual on your downed aircraft. We're dispatching a boat to your coordinates for extraction. ETA 30 minutes. Do you copy?" It was his team, his world calling him back. "This is Mitchell," he yelled into the small handset he'd salvaged from the helicopter. "I copy, Command. I have 2 civilians with me, a woman and a child." "Roger that, we'll take all 3 of you." Relief washed over Jake, swift and absolute. They would be safe, but when he turned, he saw Sarah standing frozen, her arms wrapped around herself. Her expression wasn't one of relief, it was one of grim, heartbreaking resolve. "I'm not going," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "What, Sarah, you heard the man? The dam is failing. This house, everything, is going to be underwater." "This is my home," she said, her eyes flashing with a fierce protective light. "I rebuilt it from the mud once before. I will not be chased out by the water again. I won't abandon it." He couldn't understand. It wasn't bravery, it was suicide. This isn't about being chased out, it's about survival. Tommy, hearing the raised voices, ran into the room, his face etched with fear. He latched onto Jake's leg, his small body trembling. "You promised you wouldn't leave," he sobbed, the words a dagger in Jake's heart. "You promised." Jake was torn in two. A violent internal storm raged within him, more powerful than the one outside. The sky was calling him back. Duty, instinct, everything he had ever been, was pulling him toward that extraction boat, toward his team. But his heart, a stubborn and newly awakened anchor, was here, in this house, with this woman and this boy. For the first time, the call of the sky felt like a siren song luring him to his own destruction, while the terrifying prospect of staying felt like salvation. He looked from Tommy's tear-streaked face to Sarah's defiant one. He saw her fear, masked by a stubborn pride he was beginning to understand. She wasn't refusing to leave her house. She was refusing to be a victim again, refusing to let the storm win. He grabbed the radio handset. "Command, this is Jake. Negative on the extraction." "Say again, one?" The voice was incredulous. "The entire valley is going under." "I know," Jake said, his decision solidifying with every word, "but the civilians are refusing to evacuate their home. I can't force them, and I won't leave them." He paused, the weight of his next words settling on him. "I'm staying." A moment of stunned silence from the radio. "Jake, that's your life." "This is who I am," he said, his voice raw, looking directly at Sarah. "I save people." He let the handset drop. He turned to her, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "But you were right. Sometimes saving them means staying." Her defiant facade crumbled, replaced by a wave of shock, terror, and a fragile dawning hope. The sound of the rescue boat's engine grew louder in the distance, then faded as it turned and disappeared down the valley. The sound of their last chance leaving. The creek had already breached its banks, its dark water creeping across the lawn. The river beyond was a torrent. "We have to get to higher ground," Jake commanded, his voice clear and steady. The choice was made. The sky had been denied. "We'll take what we can to the barn, and the hayloft is our only shot." He grabbed the silver-framed photograph of her father from the mantelpiece, pressing it into her hands. It was a silent acknowledgement. He understood. As the first wave of floodwater lapped at the porch steps, they worked together. A small, desperate family against the rising storm, carrying their most precious belongings. Not furniture, but memories and a newfound, terrifying love, toward the only sanctuary they had left. Dawn broke not with a triumphant fanfare, but with a quiet, sacred hush. The sky, scrubbed clean by the storm, was a delicate watercolour of rose and gold. From the high hayloft of the barn, Jake, Sarah and Tommy watched the sun crest the bruised horizon, its light glinting off a vast, silent sea. The valley was gone, submerged beneath a placid brown lake. Only the tops of the tallest trees and the roofs of a few buildings on the highest ground remained, islands in a drowned world. Their farmhouse was submerged to the eaves, a wounded survivor. But they had made it. Huddled together under horse blankets, listening to the water lap against the barn walls all night, they had survived. That sunrise marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. 6 months later, the water was a memory, leaving behind a landscape of mud, renewal, and relentless work. The valley was healing, and so were they. Jake never left. The crash that had brought him here had also grounded him in a way he'd never thought possible. With his savings and a small business loan, he had started a local emergency response centre, a small-scale operation with 2 all-terrain vehicles and a rugged inflatable boat. He was still saving people, but now they were his neighbours. He saved them from flash floods, from farm accidents, from the small disasters of rural life. He'd found a way to answer the call of duty without leaving the woman he loved. He hadn't chosen earth over sky, he had learned to hold them both. Sarah's garden was thriving again. The soil, enriched by the flood's silt, was dark and fertile. Her neat rows of vegetables were a testament to her enduring spirit. But now something new was woven among the sunflowers and tomato cages. Hanging from the sturdy stalks were Jake's old pilot medals, glinting in the sun. He'd given them to her one afternoon, a quiet offering of his past. She had placed them here, among the growing things, intertwining the man he was with the man he was becoming. Tommy had changed too. The quiet, anxious boy had blossomed. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by a bright, confident spark. He spent his afternoons at the response centre, which Jake ran out of the repaired barn, learning how to check the oil in the ATV and coil ropes with a perfect knot. He wasn't afraid of the emergency radio anymore. He saw it as a tool for helping, a connection to the father figure who hadn't left. He was learning about engines and preparedness, about courage and partnership. One warm evening, as the sun began to dip below the rebuilt fence line, Jake found Sarah in the garden, her hands buried in the rich soil. He didn't have a diamond ring. He had spent his life accumulating experiences, not possessions. Instead, he held out his hand. In his palm lay a set of keys. One was old and brassy, the key to the farmhouse. The other was new and shiny, the key to his truck. The last was a small silver key to the front door of the response centre. "I used to think home was wherever I landed," he said, his voice steady and full of a quiet, profound certainty. He looked from the keys in his hand to her face, illuminated by the golden light. A temporary base, a place to sleep before the next mission. Sarah slowly stood up, wiping her earthy hands on her jeans. Her heart felt impossibly full, a vessel brimming with a love she had once believed was lost to her forever. He curled his fingers around the keys and held them out to her. "Now I know it's not," he continued, his gaze locking with hers. "Home isn't a place you land. It's the place you choose to stay. The place you build and rebuild and fight for." He took a breath. "Will you build a home with me, Sarah?" Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so deep it was almost painful. Didn't need a ring, she didn't need a flowery promise, she needed this. The solid, tangible weight of permanence, keys that jangled like wind chimes, promising shared doors and a shared future. She closed her hand over his, over the keys, her touch warm and sure. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, always. Those storms tear everything apart. They leave behind nothing but wreckage and sorrow. But others, the ones you weather together, the ones that strip you down to the very core of who you are, they don't destroy. They reveal what was strong enough to last all along. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to open your door to a stranger falling from a broken sky, you discover that home was never a place at all. It was a choice, it was a promise. It was the safe harbour you find in someone else's heart." Almost home. The rain had been drumming against the kitchen window for 3 weeks, a relentless weeping percussion that had become the soundtrack to Lena's grief. It was a sound that mirrored the hollowness inside her, a space carved out by the sudden, brutal absence of her brother Mark. On the cramped formica countertop, 2 letters sat like twin sentences of doom. One was a pale pink eviction notice, its cheerful colour a cruel joke. The other was a crisp, official-looking envelope from US Immigration and Customs Enforcement addressed to Aidan Hayes. Deportation. The word itself was a punch to the gut, another loss she couldn't bear. The ticking of the clock above the stove felt unnaturally loud, each second a tiny hammer against the fragile shell of her composure. 3 weeks since the funeral. 3 weeks of waking up to the reality that Mark was gone, and now Aidan, his best friend, the only other person who seemed to understand the specific shape of her sorrow, was about to be ripped away too. Aidan sat across from her at the tiny wobbly table, his large frame making the space feel even smaller. He hadn't said much, just showed up with a bag of groceries he knew she'd forget to buy, and a silence that was more comforting than any platitude. He stared at his letter, his jaw tight, his usual easygoing energy replaced by a heavy stillness. The steam from a forgotten tea kettle began to whistle, a thin, frantic scream that Lena couldn't bring herself to answer. "I have an idea," she said, her voice a raw whisper that barely carried over the rain in the kettle. She pushed a crumpled tissue across the table, adding it to the damp pile. "It's either brilliant or completely insane." Aidan finally looked up. His eyes, the colour of moss after a storm, were clouded with exhaustion. "I'm open to insane right about now." Lena took a shaky breath, her heart thudding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She slid his deportation letter and her eviction notice together, placing them side by side. "You need to stay in the country. You have a job waiting for you at the bakery, the one Mark was so excited for you to take. And I need to not be homeless." She looked from the papers to his face, her gaze unwavering. "So, we get married." Silence descended, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the ticking clock and the rain. For a moment, Aidan just stared at her. Then a short, sharp laugh escaped him, a sound utterly devoid of humour. It died the instant he saw the desperate seriousness in her eyes. The tears she'd been holding back finally welled, blurring his stunned face. "Lena, you can't be serious," he said, his voice soft, laced with disbelief. "Why not?" she pushed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It's a business arrangement. A partnership. You get a green card, I get a roommate who can help me with rent, help me get the bakery open. It was our dream, mine and Mark's. You were supposed to be a part of it." She gestured vaguely around the cramped apartment. "This isn't about love or romance or any of that. It's about survival." "Your brother would kill me," Aidan murmured, shaking his head slowly. "He would haunt me from the great beyond if he knew I was even considering this. You're his little sister." The mention of Mark was a physical blow, and Lena flinched. "My brother's not here to stop us," she said, the words tasting like ash. "He's not here, and if we don't do something, everything he and I worked for, everything he wanted for you is going to disappear. The bakery, he called it almost home, because it was supposed to be the place we all finally landed." Her voice broke on the last word. She reached for the letters, her hand trembling. Aidan's hand shot out to steady hers, his fingers warm and calloused, engulfing her own. The touch was accidental, a simple gesture of comfort, but it sent a strange, unexpected current through her. It was a flicker of warmth in the cold, desolate landscape of her grief. For a split second, the rain seemed to quiet. The ticking clock seemed to fade, and there was only the feeling of his hand on hers, a silent acknowledgement of the precipice on which they stood. This wasn't about love, she told herself again. But as his thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, a tiny, treacherous part of her heart wondered if that was a lie they were telling themselves, to make the insanity of it all bearable. The lawyer's office was a universe of beige carpets and sterile fluorescent lighting that hummed with an unnerving buzz. It stripped the world of colour, making the vibrant autumn warmth just outside the window feel like a distant memory. Lena sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, listening as the lawyer, a woman with a weary but kind face, laid out the stakes. "The burden of proof is on you," she explained, her pen tapping a rhythm on a thick file. "You have to prove the legitimacy of your marital union. They'll ask about your history, your habits, how you met, your daily routines. They are trained to spot fraud." Lena and Aidan exchanged a nervous glance. They'd spent 2 nights cramming, whispering fabricated memories and personal details to each other like students before a final exam. His favourite colour, slate blue. She hums off-key when she's concentrating. He hates cilantro. She sleeps on the left side of the bed. It felt cheap, a flimsy stage play built on the foundation of their shared grief for Mark. The courthouse was even more impersonal. They were a number in a queue waiting for their turn in a small windowless room. When the justice of the peace, a man who looked as tired as the lawyer, began to recite the vows, the world seemed to slow down. The rote standard-issue words suddenly felt heavy with meaning. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. Lena's throat tightened. Worse had already come. Poorer was staring her in the face. In sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part. When it was Aidan's turn to repeat the lines, his voice, usually so steady, caught on the words, "in sickness and in health." It was a tiny, almost imperceptible break, but Lena heard it. In that moment, he wasn't just an actor reciting lines. He was a man who had sat by Mark's hospital bed, a man who had seen sickness and its devastating aftermath. Her eyes stung with unshed tears. "You may kiss the bride," the justice said, his tone flat. An awkward, charged silence hung between them. This was the part they hadn't reversed. Aidan's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. He saw the panic there, the uncertainty. Instead of a kiss, he leaned in and gently pressed his forehead against hers. It was a gesture of such profound, unexpected tenderness that it stole her breath. As he pulled back, their new wedding rings, simple cheap silver bands they'd bought at a pawn shop, clinked together. The sound was small but definitive. "We're really doing this," she whispered, the reality of it finally landing. Aidan offered a small crooked smile. "Too late for second thoughts now, Mrs. Fletcher." The name felt foreign, a costume she was wearing. Later that afternoon they stood in the doorway of the bakery. It was the first time they had entered the space not as Mark's sister and Mark's best friend, but as partners. His partners. The air hung thick with the comforting scent of old flower vanilla extract and the faint, sweet ghost of yeast. Dust motes danced in the shafts of autumn light that slanted through the large, grimy front windows. "He found this place," Lena said softly, running a hand along a flower-dusted countertop. "Said it had good bones." "It does," Aidan agreed, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous quiet. As she turned to survey the cavernous space, her foot caught on a loose floorboard. She yelped, stumbling forward. Instantly, Aidan was there, his hand shooting out to grip her waist, steadying her against his chest. She landed flush against him, her palms flat on the solid wall of his torso. For a long moment, they both froze. His heart hammered a steady, reassuring beat against her cheek. She could feel the warmth of his body through their clothes, smell the faint, clean scent of his soap mixed with the dusty air of the bakery. It was different from the touch in the kitchen, different from the forehead press at the courthouse. This was solid, real. It was the first undeniable hint of genuine attraction, a spark of heat that had nothing to do with shared grief or legal arrangements, and everything to do with the man holding her in the fading afternoon light. The bakery became their world, a sanctuary sealed by the pre-dawn dark and the scent of rising dough. Their lives fell into a rhythm dictated by the demanding schedule of a baker. Alarms blared at 4 a.m, D-O-E-M, and they would meet in the shared kitchen of Lena's, now their apartment, moving around each other in a sleepy silent ballet. They were a study in contrasts. Lena worked with the meticulous precision of a scientist, her measuring cups levelled with a knife's edge, her recipes followed to the gram. She was the architect of their operation. Aidan, however, was the artist. He cooked by feel, by scent, by intuition. He'd add a pinch of cardamom to Mark's cinnamon roll recipe, or a dash of espresso powder to the chocolate croissants, his movements fluid and confident. Baking is chemistry, Lena would insist, her brow furrowed in concentration. Baking is magic, Aidan would counter, a playful glint in his eye, as he slid another perfectly golden tray from the oven. Their days were filled with the physical language of shared work. Flour found its way onto everything, a white handprint on the small of her back as he squeezed past in the narrow walkway, a dusting on his cheek that she would gently brush away without thinking. One afternoon he stood behind her, his larger hands covering hers as he taught her to properly knead brioche dough. "You have to feel it," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "Push, fold. It's a rhythm, like a heartbeat." His chest was warm against her back, and Lena found herself closing her eyes, focusing not on the dough but on the steady cadence of his breathing, the strength in his hands guiding hers. The nights were for confessions. Exhausted and covered in flour, they would sit at a small table in the back, sharing failed sourdough starters and burnt cookies, the failures somehow more intimate than the successes. It was in these late hours, with rain drumming softly on the bakery's skylights, that they started sharing pieces of themselves. He told her about his childhood in Dublin, a place he spoke of with a mixture of love and restlessness. She told him about her recurring nightmare, the one where she was falling and Mark was always just out of reach. "He always said you made the best chocolate croissants," Lena found herself saying one night, her voice thick with emotion as she looked at the tray cooling on the rack. Aidan smiled, a sad, fond expression. "He always said you were stronger than you knew." But their fragile peace was bound to break. It happened over a small metal recipe box, Mark's box. Lena had been searching for his specific instructions for an Irish soda bread, a recipe he only made on her birthday. She found Aidan sitting with the box open, sifting through the familiar ink-stained cards. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Just looking," he said quietly. "Those are mine," she snapped, an ugly, possessive grief rising in her throat. They were his. They belonged to me. Aidan's head shot up, his expression wounded. "I was his friend for 15 years, Lena. I was there when he wrote half of these. Do you think you're the only one who misses him? Is your grief bigger than mine? Is your right to his memory stronger?" The words hit her like a physical slap. The fight was short, brutal, and filled with the unspeakable things that only two people drowning in sorrow could say to each other. She fled, the sting of his words chasing her until she found refuge in the biting cold of the walk-in cooler. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees as sobs finally racked her body. She cried for Mark, for the fight, for the terrifying, complicated mess her life had become. A few minutes later, the heavy door opened, spilling light into the small, cold space. Aidan stood in the doorway, his face etched with regret. He didn't speak. He simply took off the worn, comfortable jacket he always wore, the one that smelled faintly of yeast and cinnamon, and draped it over her shaking shoulders. He closed the door, leaving her in the cold and the dark, but wrapped in his warmth. It was an apology, a comfort, a silent truce, and in that quiet, profound gesture, Lena understood that their rhythm wasn't just about baking. It was about learning how to shelter each other from the storm. The immigration office felt like a different planet from the warm, fragrant world of the bakery. The air was stale, the lighting a harsh, unforgiving glare. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Across the small metal table, the immigration agent, a stern-faced man named Mr. Davies, regarded them with an unnervingly calm neutrality. His questions were like surgical instruments probing for weaknesses in their story. "Mr. Hayes, what brand of toothpaste does your wife use?" "Crest, the one with baking soda and peroxide," Aidan answered, without hesitation. He'd noticed it on their shared bathroom counter weeks ago. "Mrs. Fletcher Hayes, what side of the bed does your husband sleep on?" "The right side," Lena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He always takes the side closest to the door." They moved through the rehearsed answers, a careful choreography of half-truths and well-placed details. But Mr. Davies was good at his job. He circled, he changed tactics. He asked about feelings, not facts. "Tell me about your first date." A wave of panic washed over Lena. They'd concocted a story about a movie and Italian food, but under the agent's intense scrutiny it felt flimsy, transparent. Aidan must have sensed her fear. He stepped in smoothly. "Our first real date wasn't really a date," he said, his voice taking on a warm, reminiscent tone. "It was the night we perfected her brother's sourdough. We were in the bakery until 3 a.m. She gets this little frown of concentration right between her eyebrows when she's trying to get something perfect, and she hums this little off-key tune. She doesn't even know she's doing it." He looked at Lena, a genuine, fond smile touching his lips. "That was our first date, covered in flour, exhausted, and happier than I'd been in a very long time." It was a detail they had never rehearsed. It was a detail only a real husband would know, an observation born from hours spent watching her, learning her. Mr. Davies made a note, his expression unreadable, but the sharp edge of his questioning seemed to soften. Back in the apartment, the adrenaline crash was swift and brutal. The tension that had held them upright for hours evaporated, leaving them exhausted and raw. Aidan poured them both a glass of whiskey, his hands not quite steady. They sat on the sofa, the space between them humming with everything that had been left unsaid. "When did this stop being pretend for you?" Lena asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the lamplit room, terrifying and essential. Aidan stared into his glass, swirling the amber liquid. "Maybe it never was pretend," he admitted, his gaze finally meeting hers. His eyes were dark with a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "Maybe that's what scares me. I've loved you for years, Lena, from afar. You were Mark's sister, and he was my best friend. It was a line I would never cross." He let out a shaky breath. "But he's gone, and this whole arrangement, it's been torture. Pretending this is just for show and all I want to do is this." He leaned in, his movement hesitant, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. His confession unlocked something deep inside her, a truth she hadn't dared to acknowledge. She wasn't just grieving Mark anymore. She was terrified of loving someone else, terrified of the gaping hole they would leave if they were taken away too. "I've been so afraid," she breathed, the admission tearing from her. So afraid to let anyone matter this much again. The space between them vanished. Aidan's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin with a reverence that made her ache. "You don't have to be afraid with me," he murmured, and then he kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste press of foreheads at the courthouse. This was a kiss of searing honesty, a confluence of years of unspoken longing and weeks of forced intimacy. It was desperate and sweet, a raw outpouring of grief and hope and a terrifying, beautiful new love. It was the breaking point, the moment the carefully constructed walls of their arrangement came crashing down, leaving them standing in the vulnerable, uncertain, and breathtaking ruins of the truth. 6 months later, the bakery was alive. Golden hour light streamed through the now spotless front windows, illuminating the happy chaos within. The air, rich with the scent of caramelized sugar, toasted almonds, and fresh bread, was filled with the sounds of laughter and satisfied sighs. Almost Home was finally open, and the community had poured in, filling every chair and lining up out the door. Lena stood behind the counter, a clean apron tied around her waist, and watched Aidan. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, handing a warm pain au chocolat to a little girl, sharing a laugh with an elderly couple, his face lit with a genuine joy that made her heart swell. He wasn't the haunted man who had sat at her kitchen table staring at a deportation letter. He was vibrant, he was happy, he belonged. And watching him, Lena realised with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity how far they had both come. She was no longer just a woman defined by her grief. She was a baker, a business owner, a wife. Just as she was handing a seeded loaf to a customer, the bell above the door chimed, and her blood ran cold. It was Mr. Davies, the immigration agent, holding a coffee cup and looking around with that same neutral expression. A surprise follow-up. Her carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. He approached the counter, his eyes moving from the bustling scene to the two of them. Aidan came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring weight. She could feel the unspoken question in the air. Was this real enough? Was it enough to defend? Busy day, Mr. Davies observed, his gaze lingering on a framed photo of Mark, Lena, and Aidan, taken a year before the accident, that now sat on the counter. "We've been lucky," Aidan said, his hand finding Lena's under the counter, his fingers lacing through hers. "This is more than luck," Lena heard herself say, her voice clear and strong. She looked from the agent to Aidan, whose eyes were filled with a fierce, protective love. In that instant, she knew the charade was over, not because they were caught, but because it was no longer needed. This isn't about papers anymore. Aidan's grip on her hand tightened. "It never was. Not really," he said, his gaze locked with hers. Lena turned her focus back to Mr. Davies, but her words were for everyone in the room, for herself, for the memory of her brother. "This man," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "is my partner. He's my best friend. He's the reason I got out of bed for months when I didn't think I could. He helped me build this place from the dust up. This bakery, this life, wouldn't exist without him." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and cleansing. "I love him, not for a green card, not for an arrangement. I love him because he showed me what home feels like again." A hush fell over the bakery, and then, in front of the entire community, she rose on her toes and kissed him, a public declaration that sealed the truth of her words. 1 year later, they stood in that same spot, the bakery closed for a private celebration. The golden light was the same, the scent of yeast and sugar still hung in the air, but this time they were surrounded by the friends who had become their family, renewing their vows. The cheap silver bands were gone, replaced by rings of white gold they had chosen together. Rings that symbolized a promise made not out of desperation, but out of a deep and abiding love. The justice of the peace, the same tired man from the courthouse now smiling warmly, pronounced them husband and wife again. This time, when Aidan kissed her, it was soft and sure, a promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. Later, long after the last guest had departed, they stood side by side at the large kneading table. Lena reached for a bag of flour, leaving a white handprint on Aidan's apron. He smiled, covering her hand with his own. Their fingers, intertwined and dusted with flour, rested on the worn wood of the table. They weren't almost home anymore. They had built it. one careful layer at a time right here, together. Racing hearts. The silence that followed a race was a sound all its own. It was a hollow ringing in Luca Rivera's ears, the ghost of 1,000 screaming RPMs. In the concrete tomb of the underground parking garage, the only other sound was the metallic ping 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 of his said Mustang's cooling engine, a sound like a slowly calming heart. His heart. He leaned against the pony's flank, the metal still warm through his leather jacket, and dragged a hand through his sweat-damp hair. He'd won, he always won, but the victory felt as empty as the echoing cavern around him. This was his escape, the one place he could outrun the ghosts that haunted his family name. Then a new sound, the soft scuff of a shoe against grit. He straightened instantly, every muscle coiling. Cops didn't scuff. Rival crews didn't linger into the shadows. They announced themselves with revving engines and blinding headlights. This was different, quiet, measured. A figure detached itself from the gloom behind a thick concrete pillar. A woman. She held a phone up, the lens aimed not at him, but at the rear of his car, at his license plate. In 3 long strides he closed the distance, his hand clamping gently but firmly around her wrist. The phone clattered to the ground. Her gasp was a sharp, stolen breath in the heavy air. "You're either very brave or very stupid," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the concrete. He looked down at her, the wide, startled eyes that reflected the flickering fluorescent light above. She wasn't dressed like a cop or a gearhead. She wore a tailored blazer and dark jeans, a stark contrast to the grit and grime of his world. Her chin lifted, a flicker of defiance chasing the fear from her eyes. "Maybe both," she shot back, her voice steadier than he expected. "Just like you." He let a slow smile touch his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. He released her wrist, watching as she rubbed the spot, never breaking his gaze. He bent and retrieved her phone, holding it between 2 fingers like a piece of evidence. Photographing license plates in a place like this, that's a good way to get yourself hurt. "I'm a law student," she said, the words precise, as if she were building a case. "I'm researching illegal street racing for a white paper on prosecutorial strategy." He almost laughed. "A law student. You couldn't find a book?" "Books don't have the smell of burnt rubber and motor oil," she countered, her gaze sweeping the garage. "They don't capture the echo of footsteps in a place that feels like it's holding its breath. I needed to understand the environment." Her words struck a chord. She saw the poetry in the grime, the tension in the silence. He handed the phone back to her, their fingers brushing. A spark, low and electric, arced between them. He felt it. He saw in the slight parting of her lips that she did too. It was an unwelcome jolt, a current he had no business feeling, especially not with a woman who represented everything he was running from. Rules, order, the law. "Eva Santos," she said, extending a hand as if they were meeting at a cocktail party instead of a clandestine crime scene. He hesitated before taking it. Her hand was cool, her grip surprisingly firm. "Luca Rivera." The name hung in the air between them. He saw the shift in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that went beyond his reputation in the racing scene. It was a deeper, older acknowledgement. A shadow. Santos, Rivera. The names were relics of a past their parents had written, a history of tangled alliances and bitter betrayals in the city's criminal underworld. His father had gone legit, turning his mechanical skills into a thriving garage business. Her family, he knew, had not been so successful in their escape. "Rivera," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The magnetic pull that had crackled between them was now charged with something heavier. Danger. History. "You know the name," he stated, not a question. "My father knew your father," she said carefully, withdrawing her hand. The warmth was gone. "A long time ago." The unspoken words filled the space between them. "Before my family fell apart. Before yours scrubbed itself clean." Eva's carefully constructed world of legal statutes and scholarly articles had just collided with the raw, visceral reality she was only supposed to be observing. She had come here for research, to understand the mindset of men like Luca Rivera. But she hadn't expected to find a piece of her own broken history waiting for her in the shadows. He watched her, this woman who was a walking contradiction, a law student drawn to the lawless, a Santos who flinched at the name Rivera. She was looking at him with an unnerving mix of academic curiosity and something far more personal, something that felt dangerously like understanding. And in that moment, under the hum of a dying fluorescent bulb, Luca felt a different kind of risk, one that had nothing to do with hairpin turns and everything to do with the collision course he was on with Eva Santos. The attraction was mutual, undeniable, and it screamed a warning that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he wanted to heed. Eva's safe space smelled of old paper, brewing coffee, and rain. The Law Library Cafe was her sanctuary, a fortress of logic and precedent where the chaotic ghosts of her family's past couldn't reach her. Ordinarily, the steady scratch of her pen on a legal pad was a comforting rhythm, the soundtrack to her ambition. But today the rhythm was off. Her mind wasn't on contracts and torts. It was in a concrete garage, filled with the scent of motor oil and the low rumble of a man's voice. Luca Rivera. She stared at her laptop, the screen illuminating a dozen articles, forum posts and grainy race videos. He was a phantom, a legend in the city's underbelly. His driving was described as fearless, poetic, reckless. But as she dug deeper, a different picture emerged. Rivera and Sons Automotive, a legitimate, respected business. Customer testimonials praised Luca's almost supernatural diagnostic skills. He wasn't just a thug in a fast car, he was a master mechanic, an artist with a wrench and a wiring diagram. He was a man of two worlds, just as she was. He ran a legal business by day and broke the law by night. She studied the law by day, while the shadow of her family's lawlessness clung to her. A notification popped up on a social media page she was scrolling through. A friend of a friend had posted a photo from a car show months ago. In the background, leaning against a polished engine block, was Luca. He was laughing, head thrown back, a genuine, unguarded expression that made her breath catch. It was a world away from the wary, intense man in the garage. The bell above the cafe door chimed, pulling her from her digital rabbit hole, and then the scent of motor oil and rain-damp leather filled the air, so potent it felt like a memory come to life. Luca Rivera stood there, shaking the water from his jacket, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. For a moment, the entire cafe seemed to fade into the background. He moved with a quiet confidence that was utterly out of place among the hunched-over students and steaming mugs. He approached her table, pulling up a chair without asking. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, his lips curling into that same wry, unsettling smile. Eva closed her laptop slowly. "Stalking me, Rivera?" "Let's call it a follow-up inquiry," he countered, his gaze dropping to her scattered books. "I find myself in need of some legal advice, on a hypothetical matter, of course." The game was set. She leaned back, crossing her arms, playing her part. "My consultation fees are steep." "I'm sure they are." He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, closing the space between them. The air grew thick with a tension that was part interrogation, part flirtation. Hypothetically, if a person were to be present at an event where certain traffic violations occurred, what would their exposure be? "Hypothetically," Eva began, her voice cool and professional, "it would depend on their level of involvement. Were they a spectator, an organiser, a participant? What if they were just there, he asked, his dark eyes holding hers, searching for something beyond the legal jargon. Watching a woman take pictures of their licence plate. Her carefully constructed walls, the ones built from case law and precedent, began to show cracks. This wasn't a game of cat and mouse. This was a man trying to understand her motives, just as she was trying to understand his. She saw him tracing the rim of his coffee cup, his mechanic's hand surprisingly graceful. He'd found out who she was, a Santos. He knew the history, the danger inherent in their proximity, and yet he was here. "You're not what I expected," she admitted, the words escaping before her logic could stop them. He stilled. "What did you expect?" "Someone reckless, someone loud. I expected you to run when you heard my name." "Neither are you," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I expected a girl playing with fire. I didn't expect the fire to be in her." The rain streaked down the window pane beside them, blurring the world outside, cocooning them in the small, quiet space. The steam rising from their cups felt like a veil. "And for the record," he added, "I've never run from anything." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He was running from something. So was she. They were just running in different directions. He raced toward physical danger to outrun emotional pain, while she retreated into the safety of the law to escape the chaos of her bloodline. Eva felt a reluctant fascination bloom in her chest, a dangerous curiosity that her well-honed survival instincts screamed at her to ignore. Luca Rivera was a complication she couldn't afford. He was a living, breathing reminder of the world her mother had chosen, a world that had ended in prison sentences and a shattered childhood. But he was also something else. He was a man who looked at her not as the daughter of a criminal, but as a fire. And for the first time Eva felt the warmth. "One drive." The words came from Eva's mouth before she could second-guess them. They were standing outside the cafe a week later, the city air thick with the promise of an evening storm. "Just one," she clarified, her gaze firm. "No racing, no breaking the law, just driving." Luca's expression softened, the hard edges of his usual vigilance smoothing away. He nodded slowly. "Just joying." He didn't take her to the neon-slicked streets of the downtown grid. Instead, he drove the Mustang out of the city, the engine a steady, comforting purr as they climbed into the canyon roads. The setting sun bled across the sky in hues of orange and violet, painting the landscape in strokes of impossible beauty. With the windows down, the wind whipped through Eva's hair, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. It felt like shedding a skin, leaving the concrete and the expectations of the city behind. They didn't talk much at first. There was only the hum of the engine, the whisper of the wind, and the shared space inside the vintage car. He drove with an effortless grace, his hands light on the wheel, a stark contrast to the reckless abandon she'd seen in the videos. This wasn't a race. It was a meditation. He pulled over at a scenic overlook, the entire city glittering below them like a carpet of fallen stars. He cut the engine, and the silence that rushed in was different from the hollow quiet of the garage. This was a peaceful silence, vast and alive. He turned to her, his profile outlined by the dying light. "My brother died in a car crash," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its usual defences. He wasn't racing. He was on his way home from his community college class. A drunk driver ran a red light. Eva's heart clenched. She said nothing, knowing this was a story that needed silence to be told. "I was 16. He was everything I wasn't. Steady, responsible, the good son. After he was gone, everyone looked at me like I was the one who was supposed to have died. The reckless one, the one who took too many risks." He stared out at the sprawling lights below. "So, I started racing. It was the one place where I could be in complete control, every turn, every shift. It was my decision. In the car I felt alive, More than that, I felt like I could outrun the feeling that I destroy everything I touch. The confession hung between them, raw and profoundly vulnerable. Eva felt her own walls crumble, not just crack. She saw him then, not as a daredevil, but as a man trying to heal a wound so deep it had reshaped his entire world. Her own story rose to the surface, a truth she rarely shared. "When I was 12, she began, her voice trembling slightly, "my mother was sentenced to 7 years in prison. She was an accessory. She fell in love with a man, one of my father's associates, who was charming and dangerous and promised her the world. She chose him over her own family, over me. She chose a dangerous love, and it cost her everything." Eva wrapped her arms around herself. "I promised myself I would never be that stupid. I would never love someone who lived dangerously. I would build a life so safe, so stable that no one could ever take it away from me." "What if danger isn't who I am?" Luca asked softly, turning to face her fully. "Just what I do." The question was a key turning a lock deep inside her. He wasn't asking her to condone his choices. He was asking her to see the man behind them. The city lights blurred as her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing her cheek, a touch so tender it undid her. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on her lips. The air grew thick, electric with a year's worth of unspoken longing. She could taste the salt of her unshed tears, smell the leather of his jacket, feel the heat radiating from his skin. It was happening. A choice, a risk, a collision. Her phone buzzed violently in her purse, a jarring intrusion from the world below. The screen lit up with a name, Marcus Thorne, her ex-boyfriend, the prosecutor. The moment shattered. Eva pulled back, the spell broken. The phone was a cold, hard reminder of the life she had so carefully built, the promises she had made to herself. Luca retreated, his hand falling away, a mask of neutrality sliding back over his features. But she had seen him, and he had seen her. They drove back to the city in a new kind of silence, one charged with the weight of what had almost happened. They were falling, both of them, without a safety net, and every rational instinct they possessed was screaming at them to pull back. But for the first time, Eva was beginning to wonder if the fall was the only thing that could truly save them. The coffee Marcus Thorne placed on the table was a peace offering, but it felt like a trap. His prosecutor's ambition gleamed in his eyes, as polished and predatory as his expensive shoes. They sat in his sterile office, a place Eva had once seen as the pinnacle of her aspirations. Now it felt like a cage. "I know you've been looking into the street racing scene," Marcus began, his tone smooth as silk. "Impressive initiative. I have a proposition. Give my office some concrete information, names, locations, anything that leads to arrests, and I'll personally guarantee you a coveted spot in the DA's office upon graduation. A direct path, Eva. No interviews, no competition." It was everything she had ever wanted. Security, prestige, the ultimate validation of her choice to live a life governed by law and order, a life as far away from her mother's mistakes as possible. He was offering her the perfect escape hatch from the terrifying freefall she was in with Luca. All she had to do was betray him. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of Luca's confession in the canyon, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. She thought of his hands on the steering wheel, the way he made a dangerous machine feel like a part of himself. The thought of using that, of turning his world into a bargaining chip for her career, made her feel sick. But the old Eva, the one who had survived on fear and caution, whispered that this was the smart move, the safe move. That night, the lure of the race was a siren's call she couldn't resist. She told herself she was going to say goodbye, to see it one last time before cutting it out of her life. She stood in the shadows of a warehouse district, the roar of engines a familiar, painful symphony. She held her phone, her thumb hovering over the audio recorder icon. She wouldn't use it for Marcus. She didn't know what she was doing. She was torn between two futures. And then Luca saw her. He was walking toward her, a rare, soft smile on his face, a smile meant only for her. Then his eyes dropped to her hand, to the phone angled toward the staging area, the screen glowing with the telltale red of a recording app she'd opened out of nervous habit. His smile vanished. It was as if a light had been extinguished, leaving behind something cold and brittle. The warmth she had come to cherish was replaced by a look of utter betrayal. "I knew it," he said, his voice flat and dead. He didn't yell. The quiet was so much worse. He stopped a few feet away, creating a chasm between them. Racers and their crews milled around, but they were in their own desolate spotlight. The law student, researching, "I was a fool." "Luca, no," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" he challenged, his voice rising now, drawing attention. "Tell me, Eva, was our drive part of your research too? Getting the subject to open up? Were you recording then?" Each word was a physical blow. "I thought I knew you," he whispered, the heartbreak in his voice more devastating than any shout. Tears streamed down her face, hot and furious. "You do!" she cried, her voice raw with a pain that ripped through the crowd's murmurs. "You know the real me better than anyone, and that's what terrifies me. This," she gestured wildly at the scene, at him, at herself. "This isn't safe, it isn't logical, and I hate that I want it anyway." Her choice crystallized in that agonizing moment. It wasn't about a career or security anymore. It was about trust. It was about him. With a choked sob, she looked him dead in the eye. Her thumb swiped across the screen, a pop-up appearing. "Delete this recording?" She pressed delete. Then she opened her contacts, found Marcus, and held the phone up so Luca could see. She blocked the number, burning the most important professional bridge she had ever built. She had chosen him. Her actions screamed it. Luca saw it. He saw the sacrifice, his face etched with fury and betrayal, flickered with confusion, then with dawning, agonizing regret. He saw that his cynicism, the armour he wore to protect his wounded heart, had just cost them everything. He had accused her of the one thing she was fighting so desperately not to be. Before she could say another word, before she could explain the choice she had just made, the wail of distant sirens cut through the night. The crowd scattered in a panic. Luca's eyes held hers for one last desperate second before his instincts took over. He turned, sprinted to his Mustang, and the sound of his car door slamming shut was like a gunshot to her heart. He sped away, leaving her standing alone in the chaos, the flashing lights growing closer, the proof of her choice a useless deleted file on a dead screen. The garage was just as she remembered it, a concrete mausoleum smelling of ghosts and gasoline. But this time Eva wasn't there as a researcher or a trespasser. She was there to make a final plea. The sun had not yet risen, and the city was cloaked in the deep pre-dawn blue. She walked to the spot where Luca's Mustang was always parked, its familiar silhouette a dark promise in the gloom. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It wasn't a legal document, filled with cold clauses and formal language. It was a letter, written on a page torn from her personal journal, the ink slightly smeared from a single teardrop. In it, she had written everything. About Marcus's offer, about her fear, about the moment she realised that a safe life meant nothing if it was an empty one. She wrote that betraying him would have been a betrayal of the only part of herself that had ever felt truly alive. She tucked the letter under the Mustang's windshield wiper, a fragile white flag against the dark glass. It was a desperate analogue gesture in a digital world. A message from her heart, not her head. She had no idea if he would even see it, or if he would simply tear it up, another piece of wreckage in the crash they had become. Her part was done. She turned and walked toward the rooftop access stairs, needing to see the sunrise. Luca found the letter an hour later. He'd spent the night driving, the engine screaming what he couldn't say, trying to outrun the image of her face, the sound of her voice choosing him. He'd returned to the garage, his only sanctuary, feeling hollowed out. Then he saw it. He read the letter once, then twice, his hand shaking. Her words dismantled his anger piece by piece, stripping it away until only the raw, aching truth remained. You know the real me better than anyone. That's what terrifies me. She wasn't afraid of his world. She was afraid of her own heart. He had accused her of being a spy when she was really a soldier fighting a war within herself, and she had chosen him. Over everything safe and sensible, she had chosen him. He took the stairs to the rooftop 2 at a time, and there she was. She stood at the edge, not dangerously, but with a quiet stillness, watching the first sliver of gold slice across the horizon. She heard his footsteps and turned. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was mingled with a fragile, fierce hope. "I'm still afraid," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the waking city's hum. He closed the distance between them, stopping just before her. "Good," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "That means this matters." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his touch a question and a promise. "Let's be afraid together." Eva leaned into his touch, a sob of relief catching in her throat. It wasn't a promise to change each other. He would always feel the pull of the race, and she would always carry the weight of her past. This was a different kind of promise, a resolution to choose love, not in the absence of fear, but in spite of it. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the frantic, interrupted moment in the car. This was a kiss of homecoming. It was slow and deep, a final, beautiful collision of 2 souls who had been racing away from themselves, only to find their finish line in each other. When they finally broke apart, the sun was bathing the city in a warm, golden light. Eva looked from Luca's face to the Mustang parked just below the edge of the roof. "Teach me," she said. He looked confused. "Teach you what?" "How to drive it," she said, a small, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "Stick shift. I want to learn." He understood immediately. It wasn't about the car, it was about trust, about embracing a piece of his world, not with recklessness, but with intention. It was about learning to handle controlled danger, together. A slow smile spread across Luca's face, reaching his eyes and erasing the last of the shadows. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys to the Mustang. He didn't hand them to her. He dropped them gently into her open palm. The cool weight of the metal felt like an anchor. "Some risks are worth taking," he said softly, his fingers lacing with hers. "Especially the ones that lead us home."